Lecture 8.1, The Role of Government in the Economy. Where do we start with such a huge topic? We could do 50 lectures on the role of government in the economy. But don't worry, I won't be subjecting you to that. So maybe the best place for us to start is by clarifying what this topic's about and what it's not about. Our goal throughout this course has been to use the tools of economic reasoning to explain human choices and behavior. And to that end, we've adopted an institutional perspective, looking at how the rules of the game shape incentives, because we know that people react to incentives in predictable ways. So we'll stay on that path as we look at how government institutions interact with the economy. And our focus will be on choices, costs, benefits, and incentives faced by actors in government. We won't be talking about things like budgets, deficits and surpluses, types of taxation, all the mechanics of government income and spending. That's not to say that acquiring that vocabulary and an understanding of government finance are not important to students or valuable knowledge for citizens. It's only to say that that's not what we'll be doing here. Hopefully, you left the last lesson with a deeper or perhaps even new appreciation for the role that property rights and the rule of law play in causes that many of us care about very deeply: the preservation of our precious natural environment and compassion for the impoverished millions living in developing countries. While the two goals of protecting the environment and economic growth are often at odds, we saw that understanding the institutional rules of the game opened up possibilities for creative projects that advance both goals. We also looked at how the practical applications of property rights analysis grew out of scholars' refinements of the economic model of markets. Remember that Pagoo and Coase agreed that markets sometimes fail to allocate resources to their most highly valued uses, but they disagreed, and very strongly disagreed, about the appropriate role of government when those situations arise. Now, generalizing, we could say that Pagoo believed that government should intervene directly, that markets failed, and government could correct market failure through taxation and regulation. Coase, on the other hand, argued that government fails too, and that government institutions weren't designed for the purpose of allocating resources as a market would, and were as likely to fail as the market had been. He suggested that government's role was to enable the market to do what it does well by defining and enforcing property rights, the source of the failure. We'll pick up there, and in this lesson we'll focus on the actions of government as they affect the economy. On the screen, you'll see a 19th century quote from Frederick Bastiat, whose wit you were introduced to in EOFT Part 1. Government, he said, is the great fiction through which everybody endeavors to live at the expense of everybody else. So I guess cynicism about government and government largesse isn't a new phenomenon. And that's really the gist of our concern, isn't it? While we support having a government, we aren't always happy with what it does, and we're often frustrated that we don't seem to get the things we really want. In this lesson, we'll try to provide some insight into why that happens, meaning that once again, we'll be engaged in institutional analysis. Government, like the economy, is a set of rules of the game that creates incentives that shape people's choices and behavior. If we go back to our list of growth-promoting institutions, you might remember wondering a little bit that the rule of law, a government institution, made the top 4 in an economic analysis. But it makes sense in terms of the real world where institutions overlap and interconnect. Remember, for example, that we pointed out in Lesson 7 how property rights are meaningless if they can't be enforced. You may have noticed that economists tend to run property rights and the rule of law together, as if it were one term, or that when they talk about property rights, the rule of law that enforces those rights is an unspoken assumption. So it's a good place for us to start as we look at government's impact on economic decision-making and allocation of our scarce resources. We've been just kind of assuming that everyone knows what we mean when we talk about the rule of law. But given that all countries have laws and that most claim to have the rule of law whether they do or not, it's worth flipping to our civics notes to make sure we have a common understanding of that term. Some confusion arises because existence of the rule of law is not just a matter of whether or not there is formal written law or there is a constitution or a set of statutes, although of course most countries with a strong rule of law do have those attributes. The essence of the rule of law is enforcement and application. To what extent are the governed constrained by the same rules as the people they govern? Like other institutions we've studied, the rule of law isn't an all or nothing, either you have it or you don't kind of proposition. Instead, it's a marginal, a how much characteristic. In earlier lessons, we referenced organizations like the Fraser Foundation and the World Bank for rankings of economic institutions. And the map you see on the screen now comes from a similar organization called Freedom House, but their focus is political institutions, and one of the components of their ranking system is the strength of the rule of law. Here's a list of the kind of data that Freedom House gathers before ranking the countries of the world and creating their annual map. Independence of the judiciary, civilian as opposed to military control of the police, protection of civil rights, the level of political unrest and violence, and equality of treatment under the law. By this time in the course, you shouldn't be surprised to see the correlation between strong rule of law on the Freedom House map and wealth or standard of living. It's consistent with the other correlations we've looked at. Stronger institutions mean less poverty. Weaker institutions mean more poverty. Now, what about the countries in blue and yellow on the Freedom House map? Certainly, most of them have laws, maybe even have constitutions and parliaments. But if we go back to our civics definitions, we realize that most do not have a strong rule of law. Remember that the rule of law exists when laws apply equally to the governed and the governing, and the map shows that that's not the case for much of the world. More commonly in developing nations, people are subject to the rule of man. There may be laws and constitutions, but they are applied and enforced at the discretion of those in power. Countries governed by the rule of man may have many of the government components found in Western democracies, but ultimately, the person or group in power determines when and how the law is applied and enforced. It's possible for the rule of man to be benign, and perhaps one could argue that countries like China and some of the nations of the Middle East sometimes fall into that category. But harshly repressive regimes like North Korea remind us that as long as the rule of man exists, people are at the mercy of their rulers. The other alternative to the rule of law is anarchy, or the rule of force, in which people have only the rights and possessions they can claim and defend for themselves. Some of the African nations torn by unrest seem to seesaw between the rule of man and the rule of force in a continual contest for power, a contest in which the poor are always the losers. Having established a common vocabulary for the types of governance, let's move on to another question. How do we determine what government should or shouldn't do in the economy, given that our goal is to generate wealth and improve standards of living within the constraints imposed by scarcity? The economic way of thinking says we can answer that question with another question. When do the marginal benefits outweigh the marginal costs? We use that rule, if you'll remember, to evaluate private actions, and it applies to the public sector as well. Asking about marginal benefits and marginal costs implicitly recognizes that government actions, spending, taxation, production, have opportunity costs just as private actions do. So we're right back to our economic reasoning propositions, specifically proposition number 2. Choices impose costs. Governments, like private actors in the economy, have limited resources. They have a source of revenue and some ability to borrow, and they have to use that to satisfy their unlimited wants and needs. It's easiest to see these trade-offs with specific programs, where the opportunity cost of spending money in one way is giving up the benefits of spending it on another identified project. The maze of bureaucracies, budget figures in the trillions, and a seemingly ever-flowing stream of debt make the trade-offs difficult to envision at the national level, but it's much clearer at state and local levels. When government entities like school boards or recreation districts or even homeowners associations have to run balanced budgets, the trade-offs of spending on any particular project are easier to see. So we have to choose. Will we build a new rec district swimming pool, or will we increase staffing in the youth program? Will we add more police, or buy more snow removal equipment? All right, but what about that opportunity cost of government spending in general, and not just on a particular project? Remember that government doesn't produce, so it doesn't generate income. Government revenue is appropriated from us. So, at the margin, the opportunity cost of government spending is reducing private spending. Now, that isn't to say that government steals money from citizens. Through the political process, we've in effect given permission for government to take some of our income for public uses. But nonetheless, the foregone alternative, the next best choice to having the government spend it, is whatever private people would do with the money that they now pay in taxes. Which brings up economic reasoning proposition number 3, that people respond to incentives in predictable ways. If taxation reduces people's ability to use their income in what they perceive to be their most valued uses, even if they generally support the concept of paying their taxes, then they have an incentive at the margin to keep their own personal tax payments low. Thus, another opportunity cost of government spending is the time, effort, and other resources that are used to reduce or avoid taxes that could have been used in more productive ways. To reiterate then, through a variety of cost-benefit analysis examples in hiring, in expanding production, in environmental cleanup, we generated a rule for rational decision-making in the private sector. Hiring, production, environmental cleanup, cleaning up your bedroom, whatever, should continue as long as the value of the marginal costs is less than the value of the marginal benefits. The guideline for government action in the economy is no different. Governments also should do those things for which the marginal benefits equal or exceed the marginal costs. Clearly, establishing and maintaining the rule of law is at the top of the list in big, bold letters. How can we ignore the evidence? People who live in places where the rule of law is weak or absent have lower standards of living and more often than not are abysmally poor. Often they must use their resources to cope with violence, their best choice at the time, but certainly not the use they'd value more highly in different circumstances. Less wealth is generated than if the rule of law were intact. If we go back to first principles, we remember that trade generates wealth. Goods and services are created when people voluntarily buy and sell resources and products. And trade is reduced when uncertainty increases risk. You should also remember that one of the prerequisites for well-functioning markets that facilitate trade is ownership. And Ronald Coase explained the important role of government in defining and securing property rights. I think as high school economics teachers, we have a tendency to assume that our students understand that a stable rule of law is essential to a well-functioning, wealth-generating economy. And so we give it too little attention. I'd urge you to emphasize it with your students rather than just leaving them to make the connections to civics class on their own. Okay, so there's no argument then. First and foremost, the role of government in the economy is to establish and maintain the rule of law. Government secures the environment in which economic institutions can allocate resources to their most highly valued uses. But we know that that's not all that governments of wealthy, developed countries do. And when we consider those other things, there's definitely disagreement about whether and how much government should be involved. Using the guideline that government should do only those things for which marginal benefits equal or exceed marginal costs, economics has identified 3 areas in which government action is likely to be beneficial and appropriate: public goods, externalities, and monopolies. And we'll consider each in turn to figure out why. First, public goods. It can be hard to discuss public goods clearly because of the confusion between economic use of the term and everyday conversational use. One way to clarify the discussion is to distinguish between true public goods and what we might want to call publicly provided goods. There are lots of publicly provided goods and services, but not all of those meet the economist's definition of a true public good. In economic terms, a public good is a good or service that will not be provided by private producers, for 2 reasons. First, it's non-exclusive, and second, it's non-rivalrous. When we looked at property rights in Lesson 7, we noted that one of the sticks in the property rights bundle was the ability to use your property in the way you want to, and to prevent others from using it, the right to exclude others. If producers can't exclude people who won't pay for their product, remember that we called them free riders, well then they can't profit, and if they can't profit, they won't produce. The second characteristic of a true public good is that it is non-rivalrous in consumption. Knowledge, for example, is non-rivalrous. There's no limit to the number of people who can consume the fact that 2 + 2 = 4, and yet it's still there for others to consume no matter how many already have. And the same is true of light from a lighthouse, for example. But compare that to something like an apple, which is rivalrous because each bite that you consume leaves less for someone else to consume. Or seats in a theater. If you buy a ticket, there's one less seat available for someone else. And producers like that because they profit by producing more. You can see then why there's general agreement that providing national defense is an appropriate role for the government in the economy. Now, I'm not saying that there's never any argument over how much or what type of national defense, like we could miss that discussion on the national news. But I am saying that no one seems to be arguing that we should turn over the provision of national defense to a private company. It's a true public good in the economic sense. It's non-exclusive. The national defense system can't decide to protect only the houses on your block that pay for their service and not protect the ones who don't. And it's non-rivalrous. Providing national defense for you doesn't reduce the amount available to your neighbor. You could illustrate this with a counterfactual. Suppose national defense was provided privately, and someone from the National Defense Company came around or sent you a bill for your share. Would you pay? Certainly, some people would, and for all sorts of reasons, including patriotism. But not everyone. Somebody on your block or condo development or apartment building is going to figure out that if everyone else pays, he doesn't need to, because he can't be excluded from the protection. So he free rides. Other people notice and catch on, and eventually the National Defense Company goes out of business. And there won't be another company waiting in the wings to take over the service, because the inability to exclude means no profit. Now, once you get beyond national defense, it's harder to find many goods and services that everyone agrees are public goods. One example at a local level might be a kind of national defense light, protecting your local community against the vicious onslaught of enemy mosquitoes. So suppose you live in a town with lots of surface water, irrigation ponds, drainage ditches, and small lakes that are breeding places for mosquitoes. The bugs could be controlled and people could pay for aerial spraying, but it's pretty difficult for a company to go around and say, okay, we're going to get rid of the mosquitoes in this area and your share is $100. Why? Well, because people, both the backyard barbecuers and indoor couch potatoes, place different values on being mosquito-free. And because people know that they're going to receive the benefits even if they don't pay. The solution to the free rider problem of this non-exclusive good is that the community government votes to add mosquito spraying to the budget and raises everyone's taxes or reduces other programs. Now, there are arguments for projects besides national defense as true public goods, but not many. And remember that the founders were okay with that. They deliberately set up a government with limited powers and responsibilities. Go down a mental list of goods and services that we pay for through taxation and ask yourself whether each is just a publicly provided good or a true public good under the economic definition. Pick one, let's say roads and highways. To determine if it's a true public good, ask, can we exclude other people from use of a highway? Does the consumption or use of the highway leave just as much for other people to consume? Now, I'd say the answer to the first question is yes, we can exclude, sometimes relatively easily, sometimes with more difficulty. And the answer to the second question is no. And if you don't believe it, try to run your errands during rush hour. Highways are rivalrous goods, so we shouldn't be surprised that some roads and highways are provided privately. Now, ask the same two questions about public education or trash removal or fire protection, or go on down the list of publicly provided goods and services that are paid for through taxation. Can people free ride? Would they pay for it if it was provided privately? Can everyone have the same product because it doesn't get used up or degraded or diminished by other people's use? Go back to public education. What about that? If you've been teaching long enough to see your average class size grow, how would you answer the question about non-rival consumption of your time to help students? If we divide things into public and publicly provided categories, does that mean that government shouldn't be providing those things that aren't true public goods? Not necessarily. There's a range of opinions on this issue, and the proponents of minimalist government would limit the list of publicly provided goods to true public goods. But there are two other rationales for intervention in the economy. Remember the flu shot example we had in the last lesson and how we said we'd come back to it in this lesson? And then think back to how flu shots were provided publicly during the H1N1 flu virus scare a little while ago. Things like flu shots, public education, highways, and trash removal, a host of other goods and services, fall into the second category of things for which the benefits of government provision may exceed the costs, externalities, or more specifically, positive externalities. To review, Pagoo argued that when markets fail in the presence of negative externalities, government should step in to provide correction. The correction usually takes the form of taxation and regulation, as when too much of something like air pollution is produced because the producers and purchasers of products that pollute the air don't bear all the costs. But the argument also works the other way. There's a role for government when too little of something is produced and consumed because there are positive externalities and producers can't capture the benefits, or people can free ride. This is the rationale for publicly provided flu shots when there's fear of a widespread epidemic, and also for public education. Think of the positive benefits to everyone in a community of having well-educated citizens, or well-maintained roads and highways, or publicly funded toxic waste disposal facility. The positive externalities argument is also used, however, to justify public spending on city parks, concert halls, museums, even sports stadiums, but definitely with much less agreement than in the case of things like highway maintenance, snow removal, or even flu shots. The final category for which government provision of particular goods and services meets the marginal benefits are greater than marginal costs guideline is the presence of monopoly, or where there's a potential for the accumulation of significant market power. Electricity, for example, is a highly regulated industry, and production components like hydroelectric dams are often constructed at public expense. And you may realize that the price of electricity is administered rather than market generated. This is because features of that industry, like the high cost of entry, tend to reduce competition. So government steps in to prevent further accumulations of market power. It seems a reasonable argument, but it's interesting to note here that the conditions that reduce competition aren't necessarily permanent, and the cost-benefit ratio for government regulation of an industry may change over time. If you're as old as I am, you remember the market power that was wielded by Ma Bell in the relatively uncompetitive and therefore highly regulated telephone industry. And then in comes cellular technology, which drastically changed that competitive environment, and makes us now consider whether and how it changes the need for government regulation. Besides reducing market power, technology can also make it possible to internalize externalities. Transponders on cars and ships allow providers of highways and lighthouses to eliminate free riding, encouraging private producers to enter the market. But just because it's technologically possible doesn't mean that government will readily relinquish its role in the production of particular goods and services. All right, that wraps up the application of economic reasoning propositions 1 and 2 to government action in the economy. So we'll end lecture 8.1 here. Please check the lesson guide and then come back to lecture 8.2, where we'll discuss economic reasoning propositions 3, 4, and 5, especially incentives as they apply to decision-making in government institutions.